Well, it's an honor to be able to sort of wrap up. If we had operated on you, I'd be the person who's closing up. So, and it's about time for me to do a little bit of work. When Bob says, he's the business guy and I'm the spiritual figure and Mac does all the work, you thought it was a joke, didn't you? Mac wasn't laughing. Now he is. It seems like an appropriate thing to do here at the end would be to lift up our eyes and think about, let's do a little bit of visioning. Let's think about the kind of churches that we're trying to build in the city, the kind of cities we're trying to build with our churches, and then at the end I'll talk a little bit more about next steps and where we go from here. But I think before the practical, the visionary, and let's think about this. First of all, what kind of churches are we trying to build in our cities? You know that Western culture and certainly North America and Europe, Western culture, is increasingly post-Christian. I think that's a fair term to use. Our culture is increasingly relativistic, pluralistic. It's increasingly a place where Christianity is not just seen as wrong or mistaken, but at best irrelevant, and at worst a problem. More and more people think that Christians, by being Christians, are immoral, that they're actually against the good, they're enemies of the good. And that's the reason why I call us a post-Christian society, because so often people say, well, I'm not religious, I don't even care, the whole matter it's not something I even think about a lot. But if you speak up as a Christian, you'll get this long diatribe of what's wrong with Christianity, and you'll see that the culture is actually in reaction to Christianity. It hasn't gotten beyond it. It's mad at it. It's angry at it. Now, this cultural mood is not laying out there evenly. It's more the case with Anglo people than it is with non-Anglo people. There's more of an anti-religious, super secular attitude with white people have got more of it than non-white people. Cities, especially the centers of cities, have it more than in the countryside, but because the cities set the course for the culture, increasingly, it's just increasing. It's increasingly the way people are. What kind of churches do we have to build then in the cities, which are the center of this cultural milieu, this cultural mood? There's probably no better place to look for help than a guy named Leslie Newbigin. Leslie Newbigin was a British missionary who, back in the 30s and 40s, went to India to do church work. When he came back, I guess in the early 80s or late 70s, to retire to his homeland, which was Great Britain, he realized that there'd been this enormous shift, and that by going back to Western cities, he was again on a mission field. He began to realize that up until fairly recently, the culture, that you might say the main cultural institutions in the West, semi-Christianized people. So that when we did ministry, you could expect, first of all, that they would have the people who you preach to would have some respect for the Bible. They'd have some concept of what you were talking about when you urged them to give their lives to Christ. Many times they've been conditioned to seek the church out during milestones like baptisms and weddings and funerals and things like that. But that's all gone. So instead of people who have sort of semi-Christianized by the society so that they actually understood what you were talking about when you just preached a normal kind of sermon, instead of a society in which those people were kind of brought to you because they did come to church or they felt they ought to go to church and they came to church at baptisms and weddings and funerals, that's gone. And Newbigin said, what we need now is churches who know how to have a missionary encounter with Western culture and a missionary encounter with post-Christian Western culture. Now, there's been a whole lot of writing and thinking about that, but from what I can tell, these 6 characteristics I'm going to give you have arisen out of people who read Newbigin and people who have been wrestling with what kind of churches do we have to be now in the West, and particularly in the big cities, if we're really going to reach the cities, if we're going to reach the culture again. Here's these 6 characteristics. This is my own distillation of them, and be very brief. we have to have churches that are now contrast communities. The church must be a contrast community. And what that means is the way in which inside a church you've got a little city, a little human society, and how sex and how money and how power are used inside the church has got to be a sharp contrast with how sex, money, and power are outside the church. In other words, the church has got to show the world what difference Jesus Christ makes to human living. And the fact is, if inside your church, the single people are having sex as much as the people outside the church, if inside the church, people are choosing who to marry on the basis, the men are choosing on the basis of looks and the women are choosing on the basis of money, just like outside, you're not a contrast community. If we are not more racially diverse inside our churches than our neighborhoods are outside, we're not a contrast community. So first of all, and that's a big subject, but I told you I wasn't going to go into detail on any of these, the church needs to be, in order to have a missionary encounter with Western culture and really reach our cities, the church needs to be a contrast community. Secondly, churches must be servant communities. If the city sees us only evangelizing and not pouring ourselves out, our time, our hearts, and our money out into the needs of the neighborhoods, into the needs of the city, into the needs of the poor. If they see us evangelizing and not pouring ourselves out for the needs of the city, they're going to think we're just one more power broker, because they're going to see evangelism as nothing more than us accruing power, recruiting people, trying to grow our numbers, grow our budget, grow our turf. They're going to just see us as one more tribe out there vying for power with everybody else. And they might be right, even though that's not what evangelism is. If you do evangelism without service, that's how you're going to be read. And to some degree, it might be true, at least partly true. So the church has to be a servant community. It has to be a contrast community. It has to be a servant community. Thirdly, the church has to be a unifying community. Now, what do I mean by that? Because I actually do not believe that all the churches, we should all merge. I think the Lord has always used different traditions and denominations and styles, etc. But did you hear the story about the guy that was shipwrecked on a desert island? He was the only person there. And 2 years later, he was rescued. And when they got there, the boat found that the man had built 3 buildings. In the middle of the island, there was clearly a building that was his house. You could see it was a kind of a shack of sorts put together with all sorts of things and brush and wood and things. It was his house. At the other end of the island was a building. It was a small building, but it was clearly a church because there was a steeple on it. But at the other end of the building, other end of the island, there was another church building that he had built too. And so when they brought him on, the captain said, I've got a question. I understand you would live in that building right there. That's your home. I understand that you must be a devout person, religious person, so you would go into that church there and you'd be in that. But why in the world did you build yourself 2 church buildings at opposite ends of the island? And he said, well, you have to understand, I'm a Christian. And all Christians need one church to go to and one church to stay as far away from as you possibly can. Now, be honest. When I told you that joke, what church came to mind at the other end of the island? Now, Leslie Newbigin says that during the heyday of Christendom, in North America and Europe, where everybody practically was claimed to be a Christian, there were churches everywhere, how did you get a church going? You got a church going, and you gave your church an identity by identifying itself over against other Christians. You said, we exist because we're not like them, and we're not like them. To a great degree, throughout history, Christians in the West have learned how to define themselves over against other Christians. You say, you should come to our church because we're not like them, and we're not like them, and we're not like them. That doesn't make sense anymore, and it discredits us in the eyes of the world. And it doesn't seem to fit in with all the things Jesus said about, "O Lord, O Father, make them one, even as we are one, that the world might know that you sent me." Now, when I say unifying, I do not want you to say that we need to be all the same. We are going to be different. We need to be different because the church out there, the city out there is different. And if you're going to reach all kinds of people in the city, you need all kinds of churches. And yet, the attitude we have toward each other. We should be defining ourselves over against the world, not over against other Christians. And our attitude toward the other Christians, especially at the local area, at the local level, especially at the city level. People seeing people, church leaders, very different churches coming together, it's a witness all by itself. Fourth, church must be a contrast community. It's got to be a servant community. It's got to be a unifying community. Fourth, and for lack of a better term, the church must be a lay-launching community. We've got clericalism must go away, and that's hard for a lot of us, especially us who are clerics. In the early days of the church, when the church had no cultural status at all, except, of course, suspicion, when the church really, as a corporate body, had no voice because of the incredible suspicion that the dominant cultural institutions had toward the church, which is increasingly the case today. How did the church do its job? It did it because its lay people were so involved. They were out there, they were salt and they were light. They knew how to tell people about the gospel. They lived lives that were so different they were attractive. They cared about the poor and the marginal and the immigrant and the alien and the widow and the orphan. They worked differently. And see, when I say work differently, that meant in their jobs, they were integrating their faith with their work, so they did things in a very different way. And unless our churches, in a sense, become, I don't know what you say, Christian lay colleges that really, really not only really train our people well, but support them ministering out beyond the walls, we aren't really going to make the impact that we should. We need to be lay-launching centers. I'll never forget first time somebody came to me who had become a Christian at Redeemer, and he was an actor, television actor, theater actor, and he came to me and he asked me a whole set of questions, and he said, now that I'm a Christian, are there some roles there's some roles I shouldn't take? Are there some stories that I shouldn't be telling because they're bad for people? I said, probably. And he said, well, which ones? I said, I missed that lecture at seminary. And I basically came to realize that we clerics have been taught to disciple people by bringing them more and more out of the world into the church. That's how we understand discipleship. By bringing them out of the world into the church so they're more and more active here, they're here more often, they're at more meetings, and now we know you're a mature Christian. And that's not going to work anymore. The church has got to be a contrast community, a servant community, a unifying community, a lay-launching community, and fifth, the church must be a suffering community. Now, we in the West don't know nothing about this. In non-Western countries, the church often experiences suffering, and it's a major part of their inner strength, their sanctification, and their testimony and their witness. Courage and grace under suffering is an enormously important part of how churches outside of the West not only experience growth in Christ's likeness, but are a testimony to others. And we in the West know nothing about it. When we suffer, we just complain. We whine. And in the future, this is a very, very positive and upbeat and optimistic movement we're talking about here. Movement Day is talking about reaching our cities and growing our number. This is not pessimism coming from me. But the reality is in the West is the church is going to suffer more. It's going to be persecuted more. We're going to get sideways with cultural institutions more. We're going to have more problems. And we better get ready for that. We better look to our non-Western brothers and sisters and say, tell us something about that. The church needs to be a suffering community. Lastly, and this is the reason I put it last, is only because there's a danger here. The church is also a prophetic community, lastly. The church tells the truth. It gives the message. The reason I put it last, and I want to talk about a danger, just briefly, is this. So many people who are wrestling with what kind of church do we need now to be in post-Christian society. they're all over the things I already told you. Contrast community, servant community, unified community, lay launching community, suffering community. And they're all over this. And Leslie Newbigin actually says one place in his book, The Gospel in a Pluralist Society, today the community, the quality of the community, the strength of our Christian communities is the hermeneutic of the gospel. That's the term he uses, highfalutin term. What it really means is this is how people are really going to know the gospel, if they see our communities like this. And so there's so much emphasis on that. There's a lot of talk about the fact that basically Christianity is a way of life. If we show the world this new way of life, if we're a community of justice and peace, people will be drawn in, they'll become part of it. And so let's not talk too much about dogma and doctrine. Christianity is first of all a way of life primarily, right? No, and I'll tell you why. What kind of person can create, in order to create these communities, servant communities, suffering communities, contrast communities, communities of people who are living completely differently than people out there, people who are pouring out their lives. In order to create these kind of communities, you need a certain kind of person. What kind of person do you need? You need a person who's been radically transformed by the gospel. And therefore, don't tell me Christianity is first a way of life. It's not doctrine or dogma. The fact is, Christianity is first of all a message which, if believed, leads to a certain kind of way of life and leads to a certain kind of community. And when you have people say, doctrine doesn't matter, we're just going to get together, we're going to love, and we're going to do peace and justice. When people say, doctrine doesn't matter, it's just a matter of how you live and living a good life, doctrine doesn't matter, I'll say, oh yeah, when you say doctrine doesn't matter, that is a doctrine. It's called the doctrine of justification by works. It's a doctrine that basically says you just have to live a good life and be like Jesus, and that's what it means to be a Christian. No, that's legalism. That's moralism. That's just religion. And if you call people to say, live like Jesus and care for people and just love one another, that's all that matters. Don't worry about doctrine. What you're doing is you're putting a burden on people, a burden they can't bear because their heart hasn't been changed. You're putting a burden on people. Religion ultimately puts a burden on people. The gospel does not, because the gospel is not advice, it's news. It's not advice on how you live. It's news that Jesus Christ has come and saved you. He's done what you should have done, but you couldn't do. Now, what that means is the gospel takes burdens off. It takes off the burden of having to prove yourself, the burden of the past because now it's been pardoned, the burden of fear of the future because now it's certain. Religion puts burdens on people. You got to live like this, you got to live like this. I mean, there's conservative religion and there's liberal religion, but they're both burdens. There's you got to be good and you got to, we don't smoke and we don't chew and we don't go with girls that do. That's conservative religion. And liberal religion, you've got to do, peace and love and inclusion and racial justice and social justice. They're both right, personal morality, social morality. But if that's all it is, you can have it. Because first of all, Christianity is a message not of here's what you have to do to connect to God, but here's what God has done to connect to you. He's lived the life you should have lived, died the death you should have died in your place, and now salvation is a free gift. That's what creates the music of the heart that I talked to you about this morning. Charles Wesley put in so beautifully into words, my chains fell off, my heart was free, I rose, went forth, and followed thee. The church is a contrast community, it's a servant community. The church must be a unifying community, a lay launching community, a suffering community, and a community with a message. We have to preach that message. We have to call people to repent and believe that message. Christianity is not first a way of life. It's a message which, if believed, leads to a particular way of life. What if our churches really did that? What kind of city would we see? Very briefly, and I mean like 5 minutes briefly, here's some ideas I've thought about. I have to admit I'm thinking of New York City, but if the gospel spread just ran through New York like lightning, and we really saw big swaths of the city really come under the influence of the gospel, I think you'd have these are some things that you'd see. The kind of gospel-changed city would look like this. First of all, and I think this is actually a good thing to start with, increasingly in cities, people do not know how to forgive each other. there is so much turf battle. The politics, the DOB, the Department of Buildings. I mean, the unions, the unions and management. I mean, everywhere we see anger in the city, and we see take no prisoners, and we see cutting people off at the knees, and people don't know how to forgive. And if we were able to bring the gospel into the lives of a whole lot of people in the city, and people started forgiving. I mean, we have a culture that can't forgive because we need to build our own high self-esteem. We have to save ourselves. And to build our own high self-esteem, we have to say, we're right, you're wrong. We can never admit we were wrong. Never. What would New York City look like if 40% of the people knew how to forgive? It'd be totally different. It would change everything. You wouldn't even have to sit around and say, how do I integrate Christian worldview into how I live my life? I mean, if people knew how to admit they were wrong in New York City or in your city, if big parts of the city could just admit they were wrong like that, they had enough love in their heart. They were so sure of God's love. They didn't always have to be putting on a face, and they didn't always have to be saving face. It would be so different. Here's another way in which the city would change. If sex was no longer a consumer good. The biblical understanding of sex is it's for a man and a woman in the covenant of marriage. Why? Because it's self-donation. It's self-donation. You don't have sex unless you're giving your whole life to this other person. And when you say, well, I want to have sex with you, but I really don't want to, get married, what you've turned sex into a consumer good. I don't want to give you myself. I don't want to lose my independence, but I want the pleasure that you can have. So in other words, I want to get from you. I don't want to give you anything. Sex is supposed to be a way of giving yourself away, not a way of getting. Boy, would that be different. I mean, right now, people are devastating each other because they're treating sex as a consumer good. And we're using each other. Men and women are using each other. Men and men, women are women. They're all using each other. Because sex is just a way of getting fulfilled until, I read this in the Wall Street Journal. This is a Q&A between, in other words, somebody wrote into a columnist who's a professor of some sort, I guess, and the person said, I've been in a relationship with a girl for 6 years. The passion of those first days when oxytocin levels are extremely high is long gone. How do you like that? In other words, I'm just an animal basically here. My oxytocin levels used to be high and I was really enjoying the sex with this girl, but they're gone. I still feel comfortable with her and I like her, but I don't know if it's time to stop all this and leave her. Should I go or should I stay and hope to bring the passion back? You know what he said? He basically says, I suspect that what has emerged is not sufficiently beneficial for you, and given this, I would say get out. I mean, we're just using each other. What would happen if we stopped doing that in the city? A third area, of course, is morality. I think I didn't tell this story to Bob Dahl, but I talked to a Christian man who's in the board of a Christian organization over in Great Britain, and who's also pretty high up in one of the big financial institutions. And everybody in the financial world is saying, 30 years ago, there were all sorts of things you just didn't do. You might say the Christian reservoir was still there. And even though people weren't Christians, there was just a whole lot of conventions. They weren't written down, but you just didn't do that. That wasn't fair, that wasn't courteous, that was too rapacious, that was too ruthless. You just didn't do that. But increasingly, those things have gone down over the last couple of decades. And increasingly, if it's moral, nobody asks if it's moral. If it's legal, if it's barely legal, if it's something you can get away with, you do it. And he said now what's happening is people at the top are starting to say, we need to get values back into our company. But how do you do that when everybody's completely committed to the idea that, values are relative? They have no way of doing it. They do not know what to do. He's a Christian, and he says, he says in some ways it's both sad and at the same time not surprising to him as a Christian that they have no way of putting the genie back in the bottle. Because when you had a kind of Christian consensus that everybody knew you just didn't do that, so people were you didn't do it because you just didn't do it. But now that people have been doing it, they don't know on what basis to say, it's time to get integrity back, it's time to get your morals back. Who's to say what morals are? But if you had an increasing number of Christians who were out there in all the different fields, who had those moral intuitions and had a basis for them, it would change things. Rupert Murdoch has 2 different children who are over different parts of News Corp. 3 years ago, one of his children, a son, I guess, spoke at this. There's an endowed lecture every year in Edinburgh on, I think it's on business and economics. And 3 or 4 years ago, he gave the lecture and basically gave the Milton Friedman approach, which is the only social responsibility that business people have is to make a profit, period. That's it. That's what they contribute to the world. That's all you have to do. His daughter, just this year, gave the same lecture, who said, profit without values is a recipe for destruction. But who's to say? See, in other words, the world now has gotten rid of Christianity, gotten rid of religion, and it's gotten into relativism, and they want values. How are they going to do it? The only way, frankly, is if the gospel runs like lightning through our cities and increases the number of people who non-triumphalistically and non-paternalistically just start living their lives the way God wants them to live in every part of their lives. What a difference our cities if we became the kind of churches we should be. So there's churches that there's the churches that we need to build in the city, and there's the city that could be built by the churches. Lastly, very brief actually, and that is this. I said this morning, what should you do about all this? And Max probably got his own ideas, and he's going to come up here in 3 minutes and 48 seconds and tell you. No, it's 3 minutes and 45, 44, 43. This morning I said that a movement is a lot like a revival because they're almost the same thing. You can block them. You can't really produce them. Only God produces them. You can get in the way of them. Well, how do you get out of the way? Know the components. We said a movement is like a system in which everything is cooperating with everything else, and we're mutually stimulating each other, and we're mutually helping each other grow. Know your component and try to increase yours. See places that you think your city is kind of, it does mean, by the way, having a picture of what a movement is, and we've been trying to tell you at these movement days every year. Know what the components are. Try to strengthen your component. Try to get other components strengthened and maybe started. If you say we're really weak in our city in that, we need to find somebody who can do that. Do what you can to pray and do what you can to relate and come together, and then see what God will do. That is actually something over the next 5 years you can say, what can we contribute? How many new components can we start? How many churches can we plant? How do we do church renewal? How do we get people together? How do we do leadership development? Make your plan. Make a 5-year plan. Come back every year and encourage each other and encourage us and help us to encourage you. So make some measurable goals. Don't mistake that for the idea that you can produce these movements. What you're basically doing is getting out of God's way. And I think however, you do need to get out of God's way. We're in God's way all over the place. And what we need to do is we need to actually not just say, let's just pray and hope it happens. There are things you can do. So consider what those things are. Get together, work them out, see what God can do in 5 years. Almost all of us almost everybody overestimates what you can get done in a year and underestimates what you can get done in 5. So aim for 5 years. Those are some ideas about where we're going and how you can take the first steps to get there. Thanks very much.